Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 11th episode of The Realign. I am today with Anthony Galluzzo. He is the author of Against the Vortex, which, let me read the subtitle because I always forget it. It's a bit long of one, but it's about a crazy movie that perhaps you've seen, and it's about much more than that. So it's Against the Vortex, Zardoz and Degrowth Utopias in the 70s and today. So welcome, man.
Hey, how's it going?
It's great. We were just talking before, but let's pretend like we weren't
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
at all. Like, hey, how are you? So your
You brought
book,
up-
I had the great honor of getting to read an advanced copy of it for an endorsement. Um, it is about, and I wish, maybe I could even try to do this in there, but if you have not seen the movie Zardoz, you absolutely ought to. It is the strangest movie I had ever seen. And here's what's even funnier. I saw it in German dub with English subtitles.
Oh
That was
no.
my first exposure to it. And so the very famous line at the very beginning, and I don't even remember what it is in German anymore, but the gun is good, the penis is bad. But I heard that in German. I'm like, what the fuck is this movie? And it just gets crazier and crazier. So, do you want to talk about the film?
Sure.
Tell us what you think about it, or I'd love to hear you describe it. You describe it in the book, and you describe it in a very I'd say very sterile way versus what the film actually is.
Well,
Like you're trying to make sure everyone takes you seriously.
I think what happened was that they were, Carl, the editor, they told me I needed to summarize the plot of the film because they didn't know how many people were familiar with it, and that was probably much more so than the conceptual or analytical aspects of the book. It's actually very, very difficult to do because sort of a Byzantine plot.
So you get to see Sean Connery wearing like is it red or gold lame?
Red, red leather,
Oh, it is. Oh, it is. It's red leather. Yeah. Okay.
like a red
So you get
leather
to,
thong.
to see him wearing like red leather thong. It's not what you're normally used to seeing Sean Connery
Well,
as,
this
but
was the first big movie he did after the James Bond films, which is kind of an amazing thing. He was James Bond in a tuxedo, and then he's in this red leather thong, and he's wearing like this mask. I mean, the film opens, and it seems like it's set in some sort of prehistoric past, and you see these figures in these outlandish outfits. It was filmed in Ireland, County Wicklow, like near where
okay.
John Borman lived. And then there's this sort of floating stone head, bearded head, um, which in many ways was meant to evoke kind of these New Testament sky gods. I mean, I think actually the design idea Borman later said came from one of William Blake's images, and the
Hmm.
stone head is just commanding these people. Well, he tells these people that the gun is good and the penis is bad, and they should not, shouldn't reproduce. They should sort of go out and kill, because human beings are a plague on the face of the earth, right? And you sort of, you see these figures going out and, I mean, murdering people, raping people. It's actually kind of terrible. But in the beginning of this film, the Sean Connery figure slips into the head, and it turns out the head is a kind of a craft, like a space. Well, not a spacecraft, but sort of a
It's like a
technological device,
ship. Yeah.
ship. Um, and while he's in the head, he encounters this strangely dressed figure. And it should be added, like if you watch the movie, there's actually a prologue to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
film, and this strangely dressed figure, sort of offers in verse a description of the film to come. And this was actually added after the film was released because the initial audiences, the test screening audiences, were so baffled by the film that they felt they needed to add this prologue. But the Connery figure, whose name is Zed, ends up ostensibly killing this figure who's piloting the head. And then after that, this head ship goes down. It crashes into this, what seems like this bucolic oasis. So suddenly you're getting like bright colors, and you see this collection of people, men and women, who look like, I don't know, so pre-Raphaelite, um uh these sort of pre-Raphaelite figures, pre-Raphaelite hippies. Charlotte Rampling um, is among them, and what we learn is that, you have this sort of this wasteland. Most of the Earth has been turned into a kind of wasteland, and it might have been through some nuclear apocalypse or environmental collapse. But there is a kind of there's still this high tech elite that live in these, what they're called, vortexes. And the high tech elite, they're known as Eternals, and they're effectively immortal. They are somewhat superhuman. The vortex that Zed crash lands into is run by a computer called the Tabernacle. So there's a sort of religious imagery. It's a kind of it's an AI supercomputer. These beings. Essentially, they've merged with the supercomputer, so they have these superhuman abilities. So, in the early 1970s, this was a film that came out in 1974. Borman seems to be looking forward to the singularity fantasy that you hear a lot about now, particularly coming from the Silicon Valley um, circle. So, it said that these people are eternal. The tabernacle keeps their genetic codes stored, so their bodies might get old, but then their bodies are regrown, right? And there's this sort of really bizarre, one of the most bizarre scenes when Connery is on a table and they're examining,
Ah, yes.
they're sort of scanning his consciousness, and behind the Eternals who are scanning him, it looks like there are these tanks, and there are these bodies that are being regrown in a kind of synthetic amniotic fluid. So, the other thing that should be said, like, they've superseded sex. So this is
Hmm.
they're sexless, ostensibly completely rational, and immortal. And
If I could maybe put that another way, they've risen above nature, as it were. Like
yes.
all of the, yeah. Whereas outside the vortexes are all of the Stone Age barbarian violent people, and these are the ascended. Yeah.
Yes, but what we learn is that there's still, it's very close to the sort of, it's apparently close to the fantasy of decoupling that's being
Mm.
pushed by, say, eco modernists right now. I talk about, we just need to decouple from the natural world entirely, but it does turn out that there's still reliant on, the physical world and natural resources, and that in fact they're managing like the brutal population. So the human population, it's a brutal population. A lot of them have been mutated because of, this whatever apocalyptic event brought the Earth to the state that it's in. But they're managing their population through these exterminators.
Right.
So the exterminators, of which Zed, the Sean Connery character, is a leader. It's like some religious cult, and they worship this god Zardoz, the Wizard of Oz.
Right.
Um, and they're going out, and they're killing initially to keep the brutal population in check, and then at one point they're told to enslave the brutal population so that population can grow cereal crops.
Right.
And
So, and,
why is
and the
that?
key to
Well, go
the
on.
key to the utopia, though, is the, I mean, I think it's the figure of the, what are they called, the apathetics.
Yeah. So what's happening though is, I mean, you think these people are superhuman, they're immortal, they're in this sort of idyllic world that and Borman is making these sort of superficial references to people like William Morris. So they dress sometimes in these kind of like faux medieval costumes, and then they do this kind of work, but it's just it's like it's a larper's utopia, right? But at the
Mhm.
same time, an increasing number of the Eternals are going catatonic, right? So they call them apathetics. And what you learn in the course of the film is that in actuality, with each new copy, as I said, that the bodies are regrown. There's a kind of a degradation that's happening. And this is something that's made more explicit in this novel that Borman wrote of the movie after he released the movie. Um, but a lot of it is just like, I mean, it's they're a lot of these figures are sort of dying of ennui. I mean, they're absolutely miserable. So you have a population of these apathetics, and the apathetics' nutritional needs are um, what force like the eternal overseers of the outlands to sort of impress the brutals into growing these crops. I mean, the other sort of population, dissident population within the vortex, is this population of renegades. So I mean, it seems like it seems like it's this collaborative utopia, this egalitarian utopia, and even this matriarchal utopia. The Charlotte Rampling character, Consuela, and this other woman. I'm blanking on her name, but I'm blanking on the actress's name. But her name is May. Sort of occupy these leadership positions, and yet, I mean, what you learn is it's coercive in a very sort of subtle way. So they have these unwritten behavioral norms, and when one of the Eternals violates those norms, they sort of punish him
Mhm.
collectively, you know, by aging them. So it's almost like it's kind of like it almost sort of reminds me of sort of like the internet Twitter mob, right? Except it's an
Right.
internet Twitter mob with power. So you have these you have like these populations of these sort of senescent these decrepit figures who can't die. Um, and I
So
mean, so I mean, yeah,
yeah, and
up
so
there.
that's the film, and we could talk about it. I mean, we can. I really think anybody listening or watching this should definitely go try to watch the film if you have not seen it. It's a trip. But so what you write in your book? So you've written a book not necessarily about the film, but also about the film. You wrote it as I mean, it's basically film, but also historical and political analysis. You read at the beginning. I think this is maybe in the first chapter. Borman's fable exemplifies that strand of early 70s countercultural thinking that challenged the hypermodernist version or vision that drove both US capitalism and Soviet state socialism. This vision, which I will further explore over the course of my argument, encompasses familiar elements of Western and typically industrial capitalist ideology. A non exhaustive list of these elements would include a belief in historical progress, defined in entirely Western and industrial terms, and largely identified with scientific, technological development, no matter the cost. A Promethean embrace of endless material growth, and a corresponding refusal of biophysical limits and human self limitation. A reified and hierarchical split between mind and body, human beings and a natural world reconceived as standing reserve or ecosystem services for human use and manipulation. So you situated um, or you noticed that this film was situated in as a critique that was part of a larger movement, which you call critical Aquarianism,
Mm,
which I Did you come up with that phrase, or did anyone else use that before? Because it's a
I
brilliant
came up.
phrase.
I came up with that. Came
Well,
up with that.
it's a brilliant phrase, and that's exactly, if anyone's going to ask me what my political leanings are now, I'm just going to say, I'm a critical Aquarian.
I mean, I'm trying to
Um,
salvage elements of the '60s and the '70s counterculture, which really, a lot of people love to beat up on. So, I mean, that's
sure.
part of the goal here.
Yeah, and so the film was it was a critique of some movements that were, most of them were just kind of, I guess, getting started at that point. But you know, they continued while that this kind of critical Aquarianism reaction to it didn't. That got very, very buried. So that now we have this, the idea of the singularity, or the idea of, let's say, fully automated luxury space communism, and all of these other ideas that
Mm.
we can transcend the Earth, and you make specific reference to the biophysical limitations of the Earth, or of nature, or whatever you want to call it. We can transcend all of these limits for the benefit of humanity, and to the point now where you hear people talking about vertical gardening being the only way to sustain humans. So that we need to stop growing things in dirt, because dirt would be one of those biophysical limits, I guess.
Or
Plants
the
grow in dirt. Well, we need to.
famous George Monbiot thing.
Yeah, yeah.
About this, like he thinks that farming is just that's what's driving the ecological crisis. So, precision fermentation, like this sort of weird that 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 food is what we, and then we could just what I don't know.
Well,
It's like,
so can you talk about what you saw from those movements then, and I guess how you see that they've continued, and I think in a way it become even more mainstream now, where yeah, the George Monbiot stuff, that people talk about that as if that is not a really bad idea. They talk about it as if it's something that's already been decided.
well, I mean, part of it is that um, there was no monolithic. I mean, this seems like it should be obvious. This seems like it should be obvious, but there was no sort of monolithic counterculture, right? I mean, when
Mm,
we look at the
mm,
'60s into the '70s, I mean, you had a variety of countercultures and movements that which oftentimes represent, were pushing, represented uh, antithetical antithetical ideals, were motivated by antithetical impulses. So, you can trace a line, and people have done a lot of work on this, right? You could trace a line from a certain segment of the counterculture that was located in Northern California, associated with someone like Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth catalog, and a significant sector of the Back to the Land movement, the commune movement, from there to the '90s and the beginnings of internet cyberculture, right? I mean, Brand,
mhm.
um, I mean, that technology was being developed at that time. I mean, early on, of course, like internet technology was associated with the military, but there were a lot of sort of utopian hopes attached to it.
Mm,
A figure like Brand, I mean, saw his Whole Earth catalog as kind of a progenitor, a prototype.
mhm,
I mean, he saw, the reason why he embraced the communes is he thought that this would be a better mode of social, that this would be a mode of social organization that was best adapted to this still nascent technology that becomes the internet. And then
mhm.
later he sort of abandons that idea, right? He talks about, there's a point where he's talking about now, um, these space colonies. And
Right.
it's interesting. It's sort of an interesting anecdote. Um, Zardoz is a very freaky and bizarre movie, right? But the genesis of the original idea of Zardoz is very different. Originally, John Borman, who made the movie. I mean, he was fresh off of his success with Deliverance. He was trying to adapt the Lord of the Rings of all movies, and it didn't
Oh
work
yeah.
out in the
Oh yeah.
end. He had, he originally had this story idea that was set only maybe 6 or 7 years in the future, right? So the late '70s, early '80s. um, and it concerned this girl from Los Angeles, a hippie who disappears into the communes of Northern California, and then somebody pursues this girl. And Borman himself went up and spent some time in some of the communes, and he had an interesting response. I mean, rather than dirty hippies, he's like, oh, he found them to be very sterile.
Hmm.
A lot of
Hmm.
people, a lot of the people who are in the communes, he thought of as almost budding technocrats. I mean, in other words, it's interesting. And then the movie became, something very, very different. I mean, it was set into the far future, right? But I mean, the Vortex commune was. I mean, that came out of. I mean, he's extrapolating, from his experience
Oh
in
yeah.
these communes, but it's sort of a high tech version of the communes. In a way, I mean, in some way, in a kind of very elaborate science fictional form, I mean, what he saw was the culture of Silicon Valley,
Right.
the kind of the California ideology,
Well, you've
right?
you've
So,
been very critical also, or as have I, of the kind of sort of family abolition stuff that you tend to hear a lot now. These ideas of like remaking society, through the certain way. And one thing I've always noticed is their visions are actually very sterile. It's the same thing that it seems like he noticed. And I lived in an anarchist commune as well, and it's the same thing. There's this, it's like you're just waiting for them to get the clipboards out to try to codify every part of society to figure out what everybody needs, what everybody doesn't need, and so they shouldn't be having. And how much desire does a human need to experience each day in order to be a healthy living being. Let's give them that and no more, because we don't want excess, because excess is waste. And there's something very, we think of the kind of communes, the sort of hippie movement as this back to nature movement, but oftentimes it was a different kind of attempt to control nature, to control human nature, to try to, yeah.
I mean, it's a kind of they were working with the version of the utilitarian calculus, right? They're trying to
Mm,
sort of in this very quote unquote rational and efficient way, like maximize pleasures, minimize um, pains. But I mean, that said, and just to go back a moment, I mean, I don't think. I mean, that was a significant component of the counterculture, and I do think that was certainly the object of Borman's satire and critique. I mean, I think the film. I mean, one of the reasons why the film is so campy and out there is it's very much a satire. But I don't think that I mean, I call it hippie modernism, for instance. I don't think
mhm.
that exhausts the entirety of the counterculture, right? So I think that there are
Right.
other figures from the time who are very much, I mean, were very much, at least for a brief period of time, considered to be gurus, like people like Ivan Illich. Or
Hmm.
even, I mean, I have a long chapter where I discuss the work of Norman O'Brown, uh, Life Against Death, or I mean, there was a whole sort of critical technology movement.
Well,
A
you
lot
you
of,
mentioned too. You mentioned Ursula K. Le Guin as well
yeah.
as kind of part of this same critical Aquarianism, and it strikes me too. So very often, especially with the kind of modernist uh, movements within like anarchism that you see within, especially on the West Coast. It's pretty much the fully automated luxury space communism stuff, just the anarchist version. Um, but when you read her book, The Dispossessed,
Mm.
the anarchist utopia of Anaris is a nightmare.
Mm.
that's why she subtitled it An Ambiguous Utopia,
Mm.
because everything is kind of planned out. Your name is not even picked for you; it's picked,
Mm.
or you don't get, your parents don't do that. It's done from a random computer algorithm that decides what name, because there's not enough of these letters currently in the population. So there was always this critique or pushback, I guess, or kind of a hope that the world that everybody was trying to build was not the same world. Not everybody wanted to build that same future. Other people are saying, no, actually, if we go that direction, things are just going to get worse. Your idea of what will be a better way of living for people will actually crush them. And it seems like, you know, that was the way that actually got manifested. That's the world that was born from all of those movements. Now we have, everybody scrolling on their phone all of the time, like, and then trying to biohack their lives to get everything absolutely perfect. Like that, it's that didn't liberate anybody.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about someone like Le Guin, right, is that she is trying to preserve something like, I mean, to invoke like Ernst Bloch, the utopian impulse, while rejecting what she called Euclidean or programmatic utopias.
Mm.
And she actually, she writes an essay on, about Euclidean versus non-Euclidean utopias. And I mean, Euclidean utopia is essentially this, the geometric, so this geometric vision of a perfect society, which I mean is a nightmare, right? I mean, going back to, I guess you could trace it back to Plato's Republic, but Thomas More's utopia. It's why it so easily flips into the totalitarian dystopia in uh, the 20th century with 1984 and Brave New World. But I mean, but she at the and I think she's absorbed those lessons, like the dangers of that utopian tradition, while still attempting to preserve the utopian impulse. So she talks about process utopias, I mean, utopias that leave a place for change. I mean, if you want to if you think about um the dispossessed, right? I mean, the dispossessed is the story of, what is his name, Shevek, is that the main character's name? I mean, who's this brilliant physicist who is stifled by an anarchist society, which, I mean, you get some sense that at one point it was sort of vital, but it had just congealed, it had ossified. And there was no space for change or growth, and there was no space for this figure Shevek. And ultimately his quest leads him to go back to Eurus, which is a version of like the Earth. Well, it's a version of like Cold War, uh, Cold War advanced world, and that's terrible too, right? I mean,
Right.
it's he has
Right.
a nightmarish experience there, and it ultimately leads him to want to go back to Anaris, which he does, and you get the sense like at that point, maybe he will lead some movement that will open up that society. So I don't know. I don't know that. I don't think she's. I don't think. I mean, I don't read the book as depicting Inaris as a complete nightmare. I read it as a kind of, this is what happens when these movements sort of ossify. I think
Sure.
the interesting thing about that book, though, is that she very deliberately you know, decides to place this utopian experiment on a kind of a more barren planet, right? And
Right.
they're forced to adapt to the limitations of this planet, and I think that speaks to her awareness of ecological limits. And she's a woman who at the time was working in science fiction, the space opera genre. She was very, very critical of it, right? So I mean, I think in many ways she was attempting to undermine that. I mean, all of these like these the kind of like left wing space bros I mean, these Star Trek socialists, they consistently misread her, right? They want to claim her for their project. But I mean, one of her last major works, the utopian text that she sort of full-heartedly embraced, Always Coming Home, I mean, is very much based on, it's based on indigenous societies in North America. It's a low tech utopia set far in the future. I mean, there are like these remnants of high technology, these computers, but they're essentially, they're essentially off stage. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I guess that's. I mean, because I still consider myself. I mean, I reject kind of worldview Marxism at this point.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, so I was going to ask you that because uh, I think I don't even remember how we encountered each other online first, but I just remember it was like, oh, here's somebody else who was kind of hoping leftism could be something not like this, and I remember I'm not even sure what it was that I had read first, but you've always had this kind of critique of this technological optimism, and I don't even want to call it optimism. I want to call it obsession. This idea that we can work all of our problems out just with more tools. If we have the right technology, then we'll fix everything. And of course, there's this complete absence of critique of all of the problems that this increase of technology, this increase in alienation that occurs through all of this, these are actually causing more problems, which we then want more technology to fix. And it seems like I, I think it was through encountering you first that I noticed that there has always been this, just like with, in the 60s, 60s and 70s counterculture, there's always been another way of looking at this that's been
mm,
much more minority and much more critical of these grand gestures, these grand narratives, these this utopian slash Promethean fantasy that hey, we can fix the earth, we can transcend death. Can you talk more about? I guess without getting yourself too much in trouble, because such things kind of tend to get us in trouble in general. Can you talk about what you think, how you view the left in general, or I guess the general trajectory of these narratives?
well, I mean, I guess I should start. I mean, for a long time, like I was a kind of, I was on board, I suppose. I was a kind of like what, a kind of a soft trot. Uh, you know, um, I have a PhD. I went to grad school in the 2000s. I was sort of frustrated in grad school. I mean, there's still, still sort of wrestling with residual post-structuralism and these kind of, let's just say, methodological idealisms. I was frustrated by the lack of material analysis. And then I got out of grad school and I had this improbable first job teaching. I mean, I was at UCLA. I got my PhD at UCLA, came back to New York. I was teaching at West Point.
Hmm, hmm,
Um,
hmm,
I don't know. I got involved with Occupy Wall Street. I met the guys who started that magazine, Jacobin. I mean, in retrospect, they were kind of offering a very sort of crude, really kind of like vulgar Marxism married to I don't know, social democratic politics. But for me, that was a tonic,
hmm,
in response to, my experience in grad school. And I mean, they were very, very anti-environmentalist. And I had no
hmm,
environmental consciousness to speak of at the time, right? It was all, I mean, there were people invested in a narrative of progress, a stagist idea of history. I mean, it's
hmm.
secular. It's a form of very vulgar secularized Christianity. I mean, I guess that's the Vogelin, right? Immanentize the eschaton or something like that. Um, and I don't know. I was with it. I think I even wrote a kind of embarrassing one of these embarrassing pieces. The then editor Jackman was always trying to push me to write hot takes in the wake of this. I wrote this long essay about my experience at West Point, as being a Marxist at West Point, which I still I still stand by that. I'm proud of that piece. But I remember I wrote some stupid piece about like space travel because people are fixated on space travel and Star Trek. And then I don't know, the unmistakable signs of an ecological crisis and my own sort of ecological awareness. Some of this happened during a year that I spent up in Maine, in the Maine woods, when I was teaching. I had a 1 year visiting position at Colby College, and I came back to New York, and the moment I started expressing, you know, ecological sentiments, let's just say, and started, expressing some skepticism toward this narrative. And I'll talk about the narrative in a moment. I mean, these people just turned viciously on me.
Hmm. Hmm.
Particularly they had this one figure there. I don't want to mention his name. Who, in defense of industrial food, in defense of nuclear powered everything.
Is this the
You know,
Walmart guy?
you know, nature red in tooth and claw. It has to be. And, we should pave the forests, uh,
Right. Right.
essentially. I in that my book was reviewed in the Los Angeles Review of Books, and I appreciate the review in general, but there was in the review, the Cold War was invoked. It's this idea of like, oh, this sort of Cold War narrative in which Marxism is seen as a form of secularized Christianity or Gnosticism. I don't think that. I mean, I still think of myself as a heterodox Marxist, as an eco-communist, but but at the same time, I don't think that idea is reactionary. I mean, I think that I think that there's something to the secularization thesis. In other words,
So your review, and we talked a little bit about this before, and you had sent it to me as well. But I remember reading it, and the reviewer does a really good job in the first three quarters, but then like goes into a strange argument to kind of distance both your book, but also the reviewer himself from Mary Harrington and Eric Vogelin and others, like to say, hey, well, this is not really that much about nature. Like, fortunately, the author doesn't really think that nature is this important. There's kind of this messed up dichotomy, which I think is because of that American leftist Jacobin push to identify technology always as leftist, and anything that was critical of technology to always therefore be reactionary, fascist, eco-fascist, whatever. That suddenly that showed up in the review of your book, even though those weren't anything. There was nothing of that in the book itself. So it was interesting to me that the reviewer had to address this argument that again is it's mostly an American argument, and it's mostly a hey, it's okay that a leftist sometimes is critical of technology.
yeah, I don't. I mean, first of all, I don't really know what Eric Vogelin has to do with Mary Harrington. I guess they're both using this term Gnosticism, which is this very sort of capacious term, using it very differently. I also, there's this. I mean, that aside actually had more to do. I mean, I had more to do with, as I recall, the problem with talk of embodiment. If
Ah,
you remember,
yes.
like,
Ah, yes.
because I talk about, embodiment needs to be at the center of I mean, I was trying to sort of sketch in broad outline what would a kind of a different kind of socialism, a decelerationist socialism, a
Mhm.
degrowth eco socialism, look like. And I said, like, there has to be a focus on embodiment. But I mean, let me just say this. I mean, if you and you've read the book, and if anybody reads the book, I mean, when I'm talking about um, embodiment and its relationship to the natural world, I'm not talking about human nature in some prescriptive
Right.
sense.
Right.
I'm specifically drawing on the work of people like this aspect of the work of people like Hannah Arendt and Gunther Anders, and she distinguishes between what she calls the human condition and human nature. Now, human nature obviously is ideologically fraught. um, Human beings are this way or that way. Human beings are naturally selfish. I mean, if you want to translate into contemporary context, or if we want to think about in terms of contemporary concerns, I mean, specific essentialist ideas about sex, gender. That really has nothing to do with my argument. I mean, and the argument that I'm drawing on, which is that there are certain sort of our baseline condition is that we are finite beings.
Hmm.
We're contingent, you know, beings, animal beings who are born and who die, and that those sort of basic conditions are sort of they're important to take into account, and they are what connect us to the natural world. So it's a very sort of undetermined account. But I think
Right.
going back to what you were saying, it's just like just the very to even use words like that, even though I'm very specific about what
Hmm.
I'm talking about in the book,
Well,
raises
this is a bit
those
similar to the strange way that Silvia Federici got smeared as all kinds of things a few years ago, um, specifically because of her focus on the body. Like this idea that if you talk too much about humans having bodies and humans being bodies, you're somehow waging a war against everything that's technological, everything that's progress, and then also everything that's identity. And of course, and I think so. Eric Vogelin's ideas have been used to critique transhumanism, and Mary Harrington, who, for listeners who don't know, she's she calls herself, I believe, a reactionary feminist, and a lot of her work is critiquing transhumanism. And so the fact that you had even mentioned embodiment at all, or that that was such a thing, was like, oh, okay, so does that mean that he is a right wing person who is like this, like
yeah.
this
And I don't
idea
I
that
mean, her politics are right wing, right? I mean, she's
um
as
well,
far as
I'm
as far as I can tell, I don't know, but it's
yeah.
nothing I don't know what.
And it's intriguing to me, though, that the body has to have a left or a right political formation. Like if you believe that you are a body, that must mean that you are part of a political program, as opposed to well, I just apparently I live and apparently I die. So I think that seemed to be what was happening with the review, but in the book specifically, you bring up the point of death and finitude, and I think that was probably the most important part of the analysis of the film itself. Like that, the film was presenting that, hey, when there is no end, when there is no death, when your entire life is to avoid death, so that there's not this moment where it ends. You become apathetic. The apathetics themselves, like after so many living for so
They
long, being
want to die.
recycled so many times,
Yeah.
they desperately want to die, because to die would be to do something, and to give the rest of their life meaning. And there's always been
And
this.
that's what I mean. The film. What happens in the film is that effectively. I mean, we find out that Zed, the Sean Connery character, was in fact engineered by a group of these dissonant Eternals specifically to come to the vortex and destroy it, to
Mhm.
destroy the tabernacle, and to bring what's called in the film the gift of death to so many of them. And I think yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, it's, I think, and it's very much of a piece with some of what was like. I mean, this was the moment of Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death. This was the moment of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's death acceptance. I mean, her books on death and the death acceptance movement. I think, a lot of this work was drawing, in a selective way on Norman O'Brown's work in Life Against Death. And I think one of the things that happens in the film, and this is important for me in terms of my own project, is how do we distinguish between arbitrary limits, artificial limits, and actual limits, right? Because I think ultimately any sort of transformative political project has to continually wrestle with the question of what is given and what is made, right? And how, and often there are some instances where nature is dynamic, so that changes, but there are always givens. And I think, and this is sort of at the heart of my critique of Frederick Jameson, was a Marxist literary critic, obviously a very sort of important theorist, but early on he's one of the few people who writes a serious review of Zardoz. So there's a chapter where I engage with his essay, and he comes out of this Western Marxist tradition, Marcuse and Adorno, and without getting into the details of that, there almost seems to be in this tradition like utopia plays the role of transcendence, in that transcendence played in Christianity, right? This idea that, like, in other words, to put this crudely, this idea, I'm sure you've encountered this, right? Like a certain kind of Marxist, like, once we get rid of capitalism, then there's no limit, right?
Yeah, we're done. We're done.
Yeah. It's like, at that point, we can even reverse the laws of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics. It's an absurdity, right? That doesn't mean we have to let go of the utopian impulse. There are artificial scarcities, right? And I think a big part of the film is it's a very critical and satirical depiction of another big thing that gets Malthusianism. Right. So in the 60s and the 70s, everybody was worried about overpopulation. Paul Ehrlich, this biologist who wrote a book called The Population Bomb, which was a huge bestseller. And there's a zero population movement, and there's a sense that going all the way back to Thomas Malthus, who infamously argued that human population increases exponentially, but food sources increase arithmetically, and human population outstrips available resources, right? And so this sort of comes back in the 60s and the 70s, and it oftentimes had a nasty racist undertone, or was explicitly racist in the case of Garrett Hardin, who talked about lifeboat ethics, right? Like, teeming masses of the third world, who are just, they're just increasing, and they're just going to.
So from what I saw, just from my own reading, and then also a point that you bring up very well in the book as well. So Malthusianism pretty much stated, hey, there are these limits, and we know what the limits are, and it's going to be like this, and everyone's going to starve unless we reduce the population. And then there was this moment of reaction against it. But the reaction against it was, instead of saying, no, actually, your view of those limits is wrong, it said, no, there are no limits. So it was Malthusianism in its inverse. It was, let's take the extreme opposite position. Whereas, there was very little attempt, except amongst, let's call them again the critical Aquarians, to say, well, actually, some of these limits are absolutely artificial. The capitalist market, the way that it distributes things, it creates limits that do not need to exist. One of the best things is, or best examples of this is many of the famines in Africa during the 80s, were results of market distribution and hoarding, not
Yes.
from famines. Um, so, there are a lot of limits, a lot of moments of scarcity that are created by the system. And then there are also natural scarcities. There's a finite amount of lithium on the
Yes.
earth. There's a finite amount of petroleum. We know these things. And to then say, well, actually, no, there is no limit on this because we can just keep finding another source, is to just take Malthusianism as the devil and then say, okay, well, we're going to be on the side of God, and not realize that the dichotomy itself is incorrect. That, yes, there are limits, but then we have to discern which ones did we humans create, which ones did the system that we created, what is the system generating as far as these scarcities go, and then what are our actual limits, including, the ultimate limit: eventually we'll all die.
Yes. I mean, I think, Malthusianism is a term that gets thrown around so much. I mean, I was called a Malthusian for years. It's just like it's wielded in this kind of, it's a curse word on the Marxist left, right? And it's used in these sort of, I mean, it's amazing, right? These historically illiterate and incoherent ways. Like a Malthusian is also a primitivist and a romantic. Like, my academic background, I study that period, the 1790s. It's like the romantics were, I mean, they hated Malthus. That whole idea of beneficent nature that you get in Wordsworth is very
Right.
much directed against this idea of nature as this accountant, this bloody minded accountant. So, and Malthus himself saw the threat of scarcity, that supposedly comes out of this mismatch between population and resources as a spur to innovation.
Hmm.
He wasn't anti-growth. Like, I don't, like,
Right.
it's just like all of these. It's these strange things that get conflated. And also, I mean, I remember again when in these early sort of contentions with the Jacobin bunch, I was a Malthusian. Yeah, a Malthusian romantic, primitivist, etc.
You just want people to starve, don't you?
Yeah, I want, Pol Pot. I mean, it's like it doesn't. It's just It's an incoherent mixture of, it's a way of shutting down debate. These neo Malthusians from the 60s and 70s were technocrats.
Right.
They were scientists. I mean, they had fantasies of a technocratic sort of global governance regime, a kind of a biopolitical regime, that in that case managed this largely imaginary threat of overpopulation. I mean, there's a way to trace a line from those people who are not anti-growth, who are not
Right.
anti-technology, who are technocrats, between those people and these left technocrats that we see today, or the long termists, like the
Hmm.
Sam Bankman-Fried types, who they're pushing a version of the utilitarian calculus, right? With the far future of the human species in mind. At the time, there were people who pushed back, like the ecologically minded people who pushed back. Barry Commoner. There was a famous series of debates between Ehrlich and Barry Commoner. I mean, Barry Commoner's whole point, I mean, he had something of a Marxist background. It's like it has nothing to do with human population numbers. It's unsustainable production consumption, and in the global north, right? Not in the global south. That's what's driving the environmental crisis. Um, the no limits people, I mean, usually in response to the population crisis, I mean, a lot of them were, I'm blanking on the name. Like there was a kind of a right wing economist who had a bet with, have a bet with Ehrlich, or maybe the limits to growth people about
Uh,
population. I'm blanking
I
on
know
his
the
name.
story, but I forgot his name too. Yeah.
Um, but they were usually initially they were associated with like the Reaganite right or libertarianism. I mean, the strange thing about like the neo-Marxist left particularly since like 2011, 2012, there's so much weird I mean, I don't know, maybe don't you feel the same way? There's like this strange overlap with like libertarianism in
Oh
terms
yeah.
of
Oh yeah.
rhetorically, in terms of their vision. I don't know. It's odd. But again, I mean, but I think what's happening in Zardoz is that, it's a Malthusian. The Eternals are presiding over a neo Malthusian regime with these
Hmm.
stone heads. I mean, they're managing this population, and it's this population resource management that allows them to live in this techno cornucopia.
Right.
Um, so, I mean, you have a critique of artificial scarcity. You have a critique of Malthusianism, and Borman, he was left wing. I mean, he was aware of it. If you actually read some of the interviews he was doing at the time, um, at the same time, I think Borman is also stressing that within the first world, within this sort of techno utopia, that limitation and self-limitation, so conscious self-limitation, is actually important for human flourishing and meaning. So I mean, he was sort of marrying in an interesting way. I think a lot of these writers that I characterize as critical Aquarian, um, were thinking in similar ways. Like they're trying to
Yeah.
think about, you know, issues of global political economy, resource management, or alongside what we would think of as, so, we associate that with hard concerns, right? Concerns that have, a quantitative or, an obviously material basis, with more qualitative concerns about what makes for a valuable life, what makes for human flourishing. And I think, the film is trying to negotiate,
Hmm.
I mean, these false limits, this artificial scarcity, but also the kind of limits that we need to embrace. I mean, if we're going to live within planetary boundaries, but also if we want to lead a meaningful lives. I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's the
Yeah.
kind of question that just gets laughed at, right? On the left, like you can't,
Right.
like you talk about alienation, or, questions that sound vaguely existential or phenomenological, you get laughed at, right? That this is petty bourgeois ideology. This is romanticism. It's sort of like, what? I don't know. I mean, it's a strange kind of utopianism, right? It's a utopianism that doesn't want to, at least explicitly, grapple with questions of what makes for a meaningful and flourishing human life individually and together.
Right.
I don't know. It's
Right.
like,
Well, I have greatly enjoyed this conversation with you, and I greatly enjoyed reading your book. Anthony Galluzzo's book is called Against the Vortex, and it was published by Zero Books. Zero is connected with Repeater, who published my book as well. So it's all from the same conglomerate, I guess. And your book officially comes out last week, except not in America. So the
yeah,
official release date in the United States is January 1st. Is that correct? Or
yeah, January 1st.
okay. And I will make sure in the show notes to have a link where you can purchase it, either if you're in the UK or Europe, or if you're in the United States. I highly recommend it. It's a short and it's a very engaging read, and definitely I recommend also watching Zardoz, because it's quite a trip. Thank you so much for being on this. It's great to
Yeah, this is
actually
great.
finally talk to you in person. I've known
Yeah.
about you for a while, and I've always thought you were really cool, but I actually get to have you on here. So
All right.
good luck with the book release. Hopefully everybody gets their books eventually, and and congratulations.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, man,
All
and
right.
uh, and thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to The Realign. I'm Reed Wilderman. In this episode, I talked with Anthony Galluzzo. He's the author of Against the Vortex, Zardoz and Degrowth Utopias in the 70s and today. You can find ordering information for Anthony's book in the show notes, or search 0 Books Against the Vortex. You can support this podcast by becoming a subscriber to my Substack. That's read.substack.com. rhyd.substack.com. Thanks again for listening.